so please join me in welcoming Dr. Chiao.
Wow, thank you very much. Education, as you all know, plays such an important role in your future, no matter what it is you want to do. So I knew I had to do well in school, and coming from an Asian American family, not doing well in school was not an option. But this made it personal. This was something that lit a spark inside of me that not only did I not want to disappoint my parents, I actually had a real goal for myself that I was working towards. Teachers and educators, like all of you out here, you play such an important role in our lives, and as a father of young twins, a boy and a girl, education has become even much more important to me now, and it's so important that, I really enjoy coming and participating in things like this. But, having a dream is not enough. You've got to make that plan, and you've got to see that through. And so education is something very important to me, and that's one of the things that drew me to the Space Foundation, because the Space Foundation has such a rich and robust education program. Education is a big part of the mission of the Space Foundation. As you here all know, in Charles County, we've had this wonderful synergistic relationship for the past several years. There's nobody that would disagree that it's been very productive back and forth in creating and improving programs. Multi-pronged approach, right? Not only teaching students, but also teaching teachers and educating teachers about how to more effectively teach these subjects in their classrooms, and also the general public, going out and talking to the general public, educating the general public about what we're doing in space. And I think the idea is kind of the same as was, what I felt and what we all felt during the Apollo days. It wasn't just about inspiring people to study science and math, although it's important to keep our technology going, to have a pipeline of students and young people interested in that. I think the space program inspires all of us to reach a little higher and try a little harder. I think that's the most valuable part of a human spaceflight program, is that kind of inspiration. Artists, writers, musicians, I think everybody was inspired by these kinds of events, and that's why it's so important to kind of keep it going. I'm very excited to be here in this brand new high school. It's got that new high school smell. And even more wonderful, it's got this fantastic James E. Richmond Science Center attached to it. I got to take a sneak preview of that this morning before the ceremony started. I can tell you, when I was a kid, I was not much older after the Apollo missions, just a few years later, I made my first visit to the Exploratorium in San Francisco. And back then, when it just started, it's nothing like it is now. It's a huge, huge place now. I got to see it recently. But back then, it was in a large space that was largely unfinished. But there were a group of dedicated people, passionate people, with these great interactive, displays and activities. And I spent all day there, and that kind of experience stays with you. These are the things I remember when I was a kid. So this Science Center here, the James E. Richmond Science Center, I think you're going to be touching so many kids. It's hard to even imagine, especially since it's open to the entire county here. How do you clip your fingernails? How do you brush your teeth, So it's not too hard to brush your teeth, but we don't have a sink. What are you going to do with the stuff you've got in your mouth now, right? So, you've got to think through everything and plan how you do all those little things. Being in space in some ways is easier because you can move massive objects around easier because you don't have to lift them up. You have to move them slowly because they still have momentum. But then in many other ways, it's difficult to work in space because it's easy to lose things. You can't just put something down. It's not going to stay there. You can Velcro it to the wall or put it behind an elastic band, but if somebody goes by and bumps into it and knocks it loose, it's gone. And now, a lot of times it'll go in the filters, but sometimes it doesn't. Things can get lost for days, months, even forever. It's actually quite different than a roller coaster. The shuttle was really an interesting vehicle because it had the solid rocket boosters on the side. And what happens is, as you get close to launch, 6 seconds before launch, the main engines start, the 3 main engine liquid engines, and you can kind of feel those as more of a rumble, and you can kind of feel the vehicle move a little bit. And then at T0, the solid rocket boosters would light, and instantly you would get almost another 5 million pounds of thrust. So it feels like someone just comes and kicks the back of your chair, and there's a big sound. It sounds almost like an explosion. In fact, it feels like you're just exploded off the pad. In fact, by the time the shuttle would clear the tower, it's already accelerated over 100 miles an hour on its way to an orbital speed of 17,500 miles an hour. During first stage, it was very shaky. The solid fuel by its nature burns unevenly, and so you get a lot of shaking. In fact, so much shaking that you can't really read the screens very well, the cockpit screens. So while you're on the solids for the first 2 minutes, you're pretty much along for the ride. After they come off, it's glass smooth. It's like you're sitting in this room, and then starts the onset of G's. You get up to about 3 G's, which is not too uncomfortable. It just feels like someone's kind of sitting on your chest, so you have to take a little extra effort to breathe. But it's all pretty quick. You get up into space in less than 9 minutes on the shuttle, up to your orbital speed of 17,500 miles an hour, an altitude of somewhere around 200 nautical miles. So it's pretty fast. In a one word, I would say doing a spacewalk is surreal. It's almost like you're in a dream. You're thinking, am I really doing this? The very first time I got into a spacesuit, it was very exciting, as you can imagine. The surgeon told me later that as I opened the hatch, my heart rate spiked up to around 130, 140, and then when I got outside, then we started kind of going to work. It's physically very demanding. I mean, you're working inside of a balloon basically. Every time you move your arms or your fingers, you're using energy because you've got to contract it against that pressure. It's difficult work, but it's also exciting work, but it's also, you're at a higher level of risk too, right? You've all seen the movie Gravity, right? That kind of speaks to the visceral fear, if you will, that we all have when we're outside. Now, in the American spacesuits, we have jetpacks, compressed nitrogen jetpacks that we can use kind of like a parachute in case we somehow become unattached and fall off the station. The Russian suit, however, does not have such a thing. So you have 2 hooks on the Russian suit, and you've got to be very careful. You have what I call a very heightened sense of awareness of everything you're doing. You're very careful and very deliberate about making sure your hook's engaged in the next spot before you unattach this one. It's very physically demanding work, but it's also really cool. Looking at the Earth through a helmet is a lot different, and it surprised me how different than looking at the Earth through the window. Looking through the window of the shuttle, of course, it's great. It's just breathtaking to look at all the colors and all the textures and all the details you can actually see, even from an altitude of 250 nautical miles. But once you get out in a suit and you've got your unhindered, peripheral vision, then you kind of get more of a 3-dimensional appreciation of the Earth. And the coolest time I had in space was during my 3rd mission. We were helping to build the International Space Station. I was out on a spacewalk. I had my boots attached to the robotic arm or the shuttle, and I was being moved from one work site to another. And for several moments, about a minute, I was looking straight down at the Earth, and I couldn't see the shuttle or the station in my peripheral vision. And so I felt like a satellite. I could watch the continents roll by, watch the clouds, and I felt like a satellite flying over the Earth. So that was really the coolest moment. It's really no different than anything else. You've got to do well in school. To get ahead, you need to take your studies seriously from a young age, and you've got to make the right choices. You've got to stay healthy. So those are the 2 things that you really need to qualify to become an astronaut. But even beyond that, no matter what field of endeavor you're interested in, those are the 2 main things, right? Doing well in school, going to a university, and also staying healthy. So that's just universal good advice. It's a very challenging environment being in space. It's not just the vacuum. It's actually a very corrosive environment. There's a lot of atomic oxygen, and so material selection is very important. Any kind of synthetics like plastics are not going to last outside very long. Tools, just the common things you think about, the lubricants you use in your tools, the grease, the oils, they all have to be compatible with that vacuum environment. Temperature too. It can get, depending on if you're in the sun or in the shade, your temperature could vary between plus or minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit. And so everything that you do, your spacesuits, your tools and everything, have to be able to operate in that kind of a range of temperature environment, and as well as the vacuum. So a lot of good technology development into all that, the tools and all the mechanisms that we make. We test them extensively on the ground. We have thermal vacuum chambers exactly for that reason, because you want to make sure that the things that you develop, the mechanisms, the mechanical mechanisms, aren't going to freeze up in that environment and not work. We train extensively, of course, for everything, and as an example for the spacewalks, when we were building the space station, crews would typically train, as you probably know, we train in water tanks in our spacesuits to train for the spacewalks to go out and build the station. When we were building the station, we would train typically at least 10 hours to every hour we would be in space. So we did a lot of training. And not only for spacewalks, for all the systems, all the things you have to learn to operate the spacecraft, all the experiments that we performed. So that's really what we do. The training flow for your first time Flight on a space station is typically about 3.5 years because we also have to do language training. That's where I learned my Russian. I had to learn Russian so I could spend half my time in Russia working with their trainers and working with their management specialists. And the Russians had to learn English. They had to spend half their time in Houston. So that's pretty much what you do all the time, pretty much, is train. So in closing, I'd just like to say how honored and pleased I am to be here, to be a part of this. Education is so important, and you all know that. As I said, it's become doubly important to me now, now that I have young kids. And thank you all, and I wish you all the very best of luck. Thank you.